The term most favored nation takes us back to history textbooks and the world of Adam Smith. Put yourself in the 18th century, and as countries are beginning to develop trading relationships, they decide to say to each other, let's be each other's best friends. Let's be each other's most favored nation. The US did this only 2 years into our founding, 1778. We say to France, we will be each other's most favored nation. We'll give ourselves the best preferences. We'll treat each other better than anyone else. This is what it was like to trade in the 18th century, that one country would get preferences from another, that they'd be a most favored nation. But fast forward 200 years. Just after World War II, the economy is becoming globalized, and the idea that you would pick one best friend in a world of 200 friends simply no longer made any economical sense. And so this concept went into the textbooks and was left for economic theory to gather dust for another 50 years. But it's back. President Trump, and he's not the only one, a lot of populists on both sides of the aisle keep saying America should be first. America should be that most favored nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Medicine podcast, where science, policy, and innovation meet. As always, I'm your host, John Stanford. Today, as you can imagine, is all about most favored nation, what it means, what its impact would be, and having a frank conversation about trade-offs when it comes to making medicines. Let's get into the show. We now hear about most favored nation really only in the context of pharmaceuticals, medicines, and drug pricing. And it's grown because this idea has settled in that the US pays substantially more for drugs than in other developed countries, which is true. There's no denying that you can get the same medicine, often for less, sometimes 50% less, in Europe, in Canada, in Japan. And we've seen stories of people traveling around the world in order to secure that pricing. And so as President Trump, who is the ultimate populist, is looking to put forward policy proposals to the American public, he has settled in that one of his solutions to the healthcare payment crisis we have in this country is going to be making us our most favored nations. And can you think of anything more Donald Trump, anything more negotiator, I'm going to get the best deal? In May, he came out and he said he will get America this most favored nation status with the major drug makers. Now, the details, of course, were few and far between, but a few months have gone by and it's back in the news because Donald Trump is not pleased with his efforts to get that most favored nation status when it comes to the purchasing of drugs. So recently, he sent a letter to the major manufacturers, 17 of them, saying, you need to offer us the same price you offer, the lowest around the world. You need to give us that most favored nation status, or else. And frankly, if you read the letter, it says, or else. It's funny, there's a Wall Street Journal article that we'll link to at the bottom of this episode that basically says, it's a nice medicine you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. That's the tone of this letter out of the Trump administration and what has us all talking about most favored nation today. I think Donald Trump, and similar to President Biden before him and scores of individuals in Congress, they see drug pricing as a popular topic to talk about. And that's one of the reasons we unpack it on the podcast so often. But President Trump is special. And when he was announcing that this was going to be a focus, it wasn't just the good politics. He seemed personally invested because of this story from his friend. He described him as highly neurotic and that he was taking medicine, what he called the fat shot, one of the recent GLP-1s. And he told a story about the cost of that medicine in the UK being less than $100 a month. And that his friend came over to New York and it was $1,300. And that seems to have sat in his mind, as we often see with President Trump, something personal and individual, and he's now talking about this policy in the aggregate based upon that story and knowing full well that this is good politics. Because why do drugs cost more in the United States than they do abroad? And what would it mean if we set the same prices here as they did? The arguments for MFN are simple and pretty easy to understand. People think it's unfair that the same medicine costs two very different prices depending on the country you're in. But unfortunately, as with all things healthcare, it's far more complex than that. But it's easy to say, I'm for something where we pay less here. It's not fair. And that's why there's so much traction behind the sentiment for most favored nation. Reaction to this proposal from industry, as you would imagine, is strongly opposed. It would cripple, to the tune of $1 trillion, the industry. It would put companies out of business, and it wouldn't just hurt the medicines of tomorrow that we talk about so much. It would hurt the medicines of today. Even CMS admitted that 1 in 5 medicines might no longer be utilized in a post-MFN world. So that's 20% of the drugs taken in this country that might no longer be available because, frankly, the manufacturers can't afford to do them. Then let's factor in that they have no money left over for R&D. The reality is that the rest of the world is free riding off of American innovation. 70% of new drugs come out of this country, and we pay for all of them. The first pill costs $2-3 billion. And the problem is, we're the only ones shouldering that cost. The next pill may only cost $1, and that's what the price control is being set upon. But that first pill, the 15 to 20 years spent developing it, dreaming it, the intellectual property that goes into it and protects it, all of that seems to be burdened by the United States. And that's getting frustrating. It's really hard to want to be in a world where we have to invent the world's medicine and pay the most for it. And that's what's driving this conversation. The reality just simply isn't that we can import those price controls because then no one's paying for the innovation. And we should remember this is happening at a time where someone would be gleeful to pay for it. China is waiting in the wings for intellectual property, companies, and medicines to move there as they play a much longer and larger geopolitical game. So most favored nation would save money for the US government. There's no denying that. But it's yet to be seen how it would save any money for patients and would absolutely eviscerate both the large pharmaceutical ecosystem and the small biotechs that generate so much innovation. There's no better feeling than knowing you got a good deal. And most favored nation's better than that. It's knowing you got the best deal. It's like when you walk into Costco. No one walks out of Costco thinking, I wonder if I should have price shopped around. They've really established in the mind of the consumer that they are the best available price, and anything you get there, you are getting at the best available price. And it's very natural to say, well, why can't we have that in the world of medicines? And the reality is, it just isn't that simple. The problem with the Costco analogy for medicine is it takes into account the second drug that might be manufactured at low cost and can be sold at low cost at scale. They don't have the first drug, which cost $2 billion, $3 billion, and took 10, 20 years to develop. There's simply no analogy in the Costco world of something that is so complex as developing a new medicine. But it's sunk into the minds of individuals that we should be getting a better deal. And they're not wrong. The US has tools in order to make other countries pay their fair share, and it's absolutely obvious that they're not paying their fair share. Our friends over at No Patients Left Behind put out a recent study that showed at least 26% of the cost of drugs that Americans pay is global free riding. Other countries that should be, could be, and need to be paying more aren't paying their fair share, and our drugs are 26% more expensive. But I think we also have to think about what we have in our system that other countries don't. In a price-controlled universal healthcare system, like the NHS in Great Britain, they call a drug company, they say we're willing to pay this price, take it or leave it, and sometimes that means patients miss out. And that's it. That's all the actors in the supply chain. The drug company and the NHS agree to a deal well below the value of the medicine. In the United States, over the last 50 years, we have developed so many middlemen between the innovator that manufactures a drug and the patient that now 50 cents on every dollar spent on pharmaceuticals in this country goes to someone other than the manufacturer. These are those PBMs you've been hearing about that Congress wants to reform. And so when you think about the cost of our medicines, we already have a 50% markup that we really should be doing something about. So domestically, there are options to lower the price of drugs by removing those middlemen and ensuring that the savings that they realize don't go to large Fortune 10 companies, but instead go to the patients that are ultimately taking the drug. But we should also be looking for solutions around the world. The US does swing a big bat. Look at the tariff conversation we're having. But we've missed opportunities in Japan, the European Union, to insist, like we do for national defense, that they pay their fair share. Donald Trump very successfully went to the NATO countries and insisted that they start spending more on defense and that they not free ride on the major trillion-dollar investments the US makes each year in global weaponry. A similar conversation has to be had about innovative pharmaceuticals, because the reality is if we start paying what other countries pay, not only will we lose the medicines of tomorrow, but we're very well going to lose the medicines of today. I think it's important to remember in comparing our healthcare system to those in Europe or other socialized countries, it's not an apples to apples or apples to oranges comparison. It's an apples to zebra one. And one of the big factors in that is generics. Generics make up 9 in 10 prescriptions in the United States that we fill. We save trillions of dollars each decade by moving away from branded pharmaceuticals to low-cost generics that really, frankly, reflect the cost of production and very little else. Other foreign countries don't have robust generics markets. In Europe, they would love nothing more than to see a strong generic market. But they killed the outlook for that market by setting price controls on the branded medicines. Going back to our Costco example, think of the Kirkland brand. Think of the ability to sell that exact same drug at a much lower price under a different brand. It's not a perfect comparison, I'll grant that, but I do think it keeps in mind that that's how our system works and works well in the United States. The very coffee you get from the Kirkland brand is the same Starbucks coffee you pay 10 times more for when you walk into a Starbucks or when you buy their beans. The tuna is the same tuna as a high-end brand. But when you walk into a Costco, you're accessing all of that previous innovation at a much lower price. That is actually how it's working. And that doesn't exist in Europe. And we should be mindful of that. It is a very challenging time already for the generics industry. And when you hear news about shortages, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about there just not being enough money in the system for generics to be made. That's the direction we would head in, and head in fast, in a most favored nation reality. Incubate's going to be looking deeper, as I'm sure several other folks will be researching, are the cost savings real here? We have to remember that a proposal like this is being used politically in the short term. But what are the long-term costs of moving away from a generics industry? I think they would eat a lot into the initial celebration of getting our drugs at lower prices, to say nothing of the fact that the drugs might not be available, and we certainly wouldn't have the money for R&D to invest further. The president has given a clear deadline for companies to respond and to react and to lower their prices. That's about where the clarity ends. Because what's not even clear is what he would do in terms of enforcement should they not lower their prices, but also what kind of legal authority he has. And there's a lot to debate there, but I think the key takeaway is we really don't know what Trump's next move is. What we do know is that this is something he is very focused on and is investing a lot of energy in. Now, something that we also should pay attention to, because he mentioned it in May and he mentioned it in these letters, is the growing consideration of direct-to-consumer, or I guess in this case, direct-to-patient sales, and the savings that can be realized there if we cut out those middlemen. There's a great example, and this is already happening. Lilly, for example, has begun to sell its GLP-1 at a discount by going direct to the patient. And it's not a nominal discount. Their drug, which costs roughly $1,000 a month, goes down to $400 a month when you sign up for their direct-to-consumer or direct-to-patient savings program. So the president's not wrong to look in that direction for a solution here. That's the carrot opportunity. And we'll probably see the rise of more of these direct-to-consumer, direct-to-patient solutions, but the stick is one that, frankly, we can all live without. So where does this leave us? Well, we don't know what the next moves will be, but one thing we feel strongly about, we already are the most favored nation. The United States is the medicine cabinet of the world. We develop almost all of the new drugs, and our citizenry has access to them far earlier than everyone else. It's true that we pay more for the same drugs here than we do abroad. And that's a flaw of a broken system, a system of too many middlemen in the US, and a system of countries around the world not paying their fair share. We're going to be working alongside the Trump administration to address both those concerns, because we should be able to drive down prices here and have a more efficient system that saves not just the government money, but patients as well. So no matter your perspective, whether you think we already are the most favored nation or you'd like to be one, it's clear that this conversation is going to continue, and that addressing the cost of medicine here and around the world is going to remain a topic of interest to the president, to us here at Incubate, and to millions of Americans who take them as patients. But if we're going to move forward on addressing the broken healthcare system in this country, it's going to start with honest conversations, like this one. It's clear that most favored nation is something we should be talking about. It would come with substantial consequences. But it's also given rise to other pieces of the conversation about removing the middlemen and allowing a direct-to-patient market to begin to grow. That would be transformational, frankly, but still keep the guardrails of innovation in place. So we look forward to having this conversation. We'll continue to be providing updates, and we're certain this is something we'll continue to hear from the president about. Do you have a thought or a question about MFN or anything else we've talked about in today's episode? Drop a comment, and we'll be sure to answer it next week. That's all for this episode of the Making Medicine podcast. Reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can stay up to date on the world of policy and innovation. Follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram using the links in the description of this video. And as always, keep innovating.